Right, good morning. I think we'll probably start with introductions and probably start with Angela. So tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Ocean Winds and your plans, because there's some what I would call very, very large plans in terms of energy generation over the next couple of years.
Oh yeah, okay. Firstly, it's nice to be here, and thanks Bord na Móna for inviting Ocean Winds here today. So my name is Angela Larkin. I'm Project Director for Ocean Winds in Ireland. I've worked with onshore development for about 15 years now in Ireland, Scotland, also working in Spain and Germany for a number of years. The last couple of years then joined Ocean Winds as they identified Ireland as one of the countries they'd like to move into. So Ocean Winds, just for a bit of background for everyone here, is a 50-50 joint venture between ENGIE, which is a French energy provider. They've gone through their own transition at the moment. They're a conventional provider, but also globally would have onshore solar and offshore wind. And then a 50% owner of EDPR, which is a Portuguese energy provider. So both those companies came together in 2019 with the sole purpose under Ocean Winds to deliver offshore wind. So for us, offshore wind, we have about 16 gigawatts of seabed exclusivity globally. We've an operational site, Moray East in the Moray Firth, about an hour north of Aberdeen, which is just under 900 megawatts in operation. We have an operational wind farm in Belgium, and we also have a floating project off the coast of Portugal. So that was started off as a pilot project and then moved into commercial operation a couple of years ago. So it's a smaller scale floating project. And this year we have started construction in another project in the Moray Firth, and also we've financial close on 3 projects in France, 2 bottom fixed and 1 floating. So they're going into construction. And then we would be a seabed exclusivity in the US, South Korea, and also looking at other opportunities in Europe. Just maybe to give a bit of context about Ireland, we came here in 2019. I think what we saw in Ireland, that the government were setting targets. We've seen movement as regards legislation and the regulatory policy. So Ireland was identified as one area that we would like to operate in. And then last year we joined Bord na Móna 50-50 partnership in Ireland to develop offshore wind. So
brilliant, fantastic. John, everyone knows, and we probably have a slightly different audience in the room and know a little bit more about the recent Bord na Móna story, but everybody knows Bord na Móna traditionally, Pete Baquette's and thoughts about that and so on. But tell us a little bit about yourself and just the massive transition, the massive amount of investment that Bord na Móna is making in relation to renewable energy.
Yeah, thanks Dermot, and again, delighted to be here this morning. And I have to say, well done to the Bord na Móna team that's been involved in putting the event together. It's absolutely fantastic. And so in terms of Bord na Móna, I suppose we're getting to the point now where I keep telling people we were the artist formerly known as the Peat Company. And you know, that in itself is quite remarkable, because this year, and peat has been so important to the fabric of the Midlands economy, so important to energy security in Ireland. So the fact that we have been, and let's be clear about it, we've been forced to move away from that as a fossil fuel. It's incredible to think that this year, 2023, will see peat finally removed from the energy mix in Ireland. And that's quite incredible for somebody who's been involved in the sector for most of my professional career, only 25 years. To see that happening is quite incredible. And I suppose when the company decided that this was the direction that it needed to move in, we needed to turn our back on fossil fuels and look to the future. The simple thing to do would have been to put the lock on the gate, to wind that business down in a sustainable way and put the locks on the gates and move on. But the company is an energy company at its core. It's been involved in the security of supply of energy for the state almost since the foundation of the state. And we have an opportunity to continue to do that in the context of renewable energy at scale. One of the big strategic advantages that we have as a company is that the 80,000 hectares of land that was involved in energy production for the state in the context of milled peat and peat for generation and peat for home heating that land bank is infinitely suitable for the development and the delivery of large-scale infrastructure, energy infrastructure projects at scale. And over the last decade, I suppose as a company, we've dipped our toe into that water. It has been a challenging journey. It has. The acceptability of infrastructure, the acceptability of large-scale infrastructure is a challenge. But I think what we're seeing now is the benefit that renewable energy and that Ireland as an island sitting on the edge of the Atlantic has in terms of this brilliant resource in the context of wind and how we manage it on the power system and convert it into energy, so that we're no longer buying gas from wherever we're buying it, or oil from wherever we're buying it, or even coal from wherever we're buying it. We're using an indigenous source of energy to secure our energy future. And the fact that Bord na Móna as a company has found a niche and a place in that is fantastic. And that is, in my 15 years with the company, that's the evolution that we've seen with the company. And we now have a very solid €2.7 billion investment programme that we want to put into helping Ireland meet its energy challenges. The bulk of that investment will go into renewable energies. But I think it was very interesting this morning to hear Katie and Epicensor talking about the challenges that there are in pushing renewable energy, which is intermittent, onto the system and managing it. But the fact that Bord na Móna is at the centre of that transition nationally is absolutely fantastic. From my own perspective, I've been in the sector about 25 years, and we probably give off a lot at times about the fact that things aren't happening quickly enough and things aren't happening at pace. Sometimes I need to slow down and look back at what we as a country have achieved, what Bord na Móna as a company has achieved in 20 years. 20 years is a relatively short space of time, and it's interesting because the big target that we have out there from the country's and the global's perspective in terms of turning the tide on the climate agenda is just over 20 years away. And in the last 20 years, we've achieved a hell of a lot, both as a company and as a country in terms of the energy transition. And I suppose it's I'm a chemist by profession. I started out my career in the pharmachem sector, but the energy sector and the energy transition really motivates me, and I'm delighted to be part of it.
Great. Just briefly, Cara was just introducing myself as I came on stage. I'm the CEO of the Industry Research and Development Group, so we're a membership organisation. Bord na Móna, one of our members, over 300 companies engaged in research and innovation across the country, and with a large focus on sustainability and digital transformation. But what really struck me was listening to David earlier in relation to the need for collaboration across business, across society, and I think a comment somebody made at an event recently was, this is a problem so large that nobody on their own can solve it. Right? It's societal, it's systemic, it's something we're all involved in. So on its surface, the topic sounds like it's something we could agree on and be gone in 5 minutes. Right? The way we generate energy has changed forever. And I sort of conscious of that personally when about 6 or 7 years ago, my kids essentially said, "Dad, you can't put peat briquettes in a stove anymore because the planet is burning down," and we had to stop at that point. And so it was interesting to me that, and they were, so the eldest was probably about 12 at the time, but they were, really strong in terms of things that we shouldn't and couldn't be doing. So we talk about this transition and we see this remarkable future. But the reality is, it's not just electricity, right? It is transport, it is general heat, it's power. Like transport alone is 25% of energy demand. So is the reality, is that actually changing, right? Or are parts of it changing, but a lot of it is going to take a long time to change? John, and then we'll come to Angela.
Yeah. I think first of all, and you're absolutely correct, so much of the focus, the electricity sector in Ireland has decarbonised at a pace much faster than any other sectors. And the reason for that is relatively simple, because the technologies were there to do it in a relatively cost-effective way. Now, as we get from the point of where we're at today to squeezing the last ton of carbon. As I said, the last 1 million tonnes of carbon that we squeeze out of the electric power system will be an expensive 1 million tonnes. The last 500,000 tonnes that we squeeze out will be a very expensive. And the final tonne that we squeeze out could be almost too expensive. And we have to look at that. But one of the reasons that globally we're driving at the decarbonising of electric power systems is that we can see electrification as a vector to decarbonise, particularly heating and transport. So transport is one of the obvious ones, with the increase in the proliferation of electric vehicles. If we can take petrol and diesel off the road and replace it with electricity, that electricity must come from low carbon or zero carbon technologies, or we're defeating the purpose. So I think we are beginning to see more of a focus now on how we decarbonise those more difficult sectors. Minister Cleary made reference this morning to industry and how we decarbonise electrical or industrial processes, from the agri-sector, the agri-food sector, to the pharmachem sector, to the ICT sector. You know, big energy users in their own right, and we've got to look at ways that we decarbonise those, and electricity can be a solution in many ways. So I think again, going back to the fact that how much the power system has changed in 20 years, it's amazing to think that 20 years ago, 60% of the electricity demand annually was met from a basket of coal, peat and oil. And only 5% was met from renewables. And that was predominantly hydro. And in 20 years, we flipped that on its head. We need to increase the pace of that as we move forward. But we'd be very confident that Ireland has the system, the resources, the technologies and the capabilities to see 90% of its electricity generated from renewables in a little over a decade. And if we're pushing on with electrification to the fullest extent we can, I think we will really make inroads in the other sectors.
Angela, your thoughts?
Yeah, just from an offshore perspective, I suppose, you know, the government has the 5 gigawatt targets for 2030, and they've identified where that is going to go on the grid, and then the additional 2 gigawatts of non-grid for floating for 2030. But for us, like, we have an amazing offshore resource here in Ireland. We've relatively shallow waters in the east and the southeast. A lot of countries in Europe would be very envious of that. And then when you look to the west coast, very challenging seas, but extremely strong wind resource. And we also have such a huge maritime area relative to our size of an island. But when we look then at the 2040 and the 2050 targets, which are huge, 20 gigawatts, what we need to see as an investor is looking is, where is that going to be connected? How is that going to link with interconnection policy? As you say, with hydrogen policy, that's the longer term strategy we need to see. If you are going to deploy at that kind of scale for offshore, you need to see where your offtake, you need to see your end users. That's ultimately what you need as an investor, what we need to see. I think for the 5 and the 7 gigawatts, there is capacity there with EirGrid and the shaping our electricity, you know, the revision coming out this summer. But for the longer term targets, that's where we need the government, and all of us need to be looking, where is that going to be used? And if you look at what the energy demand for Europe is over the next number of years, like interconnection, that is something that we'd be keen to see.
Are we coming at this from the wrong angle, right? Because in some respects we're talking about taking the existing systems that we have and powering them with electricity, which is generated by wind or solar, or, you know, and battery backup and various other systems. Should we be thinking about, instead of, you know, having 2 million electric cars or 1 million electric cars on the road, having half that number of cars on the road, shifting people to public transport, shifting people to different modes of walking? Do we need to radically rethink our consumption of energy as much as the production of energy, rather than just say, right, demand is currently X, and if we shift to, you know, if everybody's an electric car, demand will be Y, so we need to produce Y. That we need to be we need to radically rethink how we're shaping society in relation to our focus, because there's a growing sense of urgency, which is great. But I wonder, are we just, are we literally paving the cowpath? Are we taking existing systems that are not necessarily optimal and just electrifying them?
Yeah, I think that is, first and foremost, the best way to solve the climate challenge is to reduce the amount of energy that we use. And I think energy conservation, energy efficiency is a core part of the overall drive to that. I think, though, we don't solve this challenge without bringing the public along with us, the customers along with us. And you can tackle the climate challenge, I think, in many, many different ways. You will hear people say that we need to completely rethink everything we do. We need to change our view to transport and how we use transport and how we use heating. We need to cull half of the national herd. We need to do whatever. I think if we come at it initially from that place, we're going to find it very, very difficult to bring people with us. In any walk of life, the most difficult thing any of us face is change. And people don't want to see their quality of life and the things that they do change dramatically. I think over time, if we're going to crack this thing, if we're going to get to net zero globally, we are going to see society have to operate in certain sectors and places in a very different way that it does today. But to me, that transition needs to be gradual. We need to get people to buy into it. I live in South Kildare. There's no point in telling me about walking down cycle lanes. I mean, but there isn't. There isn't. And that debate sometimes is what does annoy people. But telling me that I should really think about taking the diesel out of my car and shifting to an electric vehicle and shifting to a heat pump, I can buy into that. And I think it's a combination of all of those things. And the one thing that really gives me heart is that you could have had an event like this 4 or 5 years ago and it would be difficult to fill the room. It is incredible, and again, Deputy Cleary referred to it today, where sustainability and whatever sustainability means, and it means different things to different people, that's beginning to embed itself into society. And that, to me, is the starting point. And interestingly, the energy crisis that we're still in the middle of right now has brought home to people the reality of energy security. We've had an incredibly secure energy system here in Ireland for 20 years, relatively low prices. That's a debate, but relatively low prices. Energy's been quite cheap. Energy consumption has increased, and people didn't worry about where they got their energy from. I think what's happened in the horrible situation that's happened in Ukraine, one of the bright sides of that is people have really begun to think about energy security. And we may not take energy security for granted in the next decade to the extent we did in the past. And people understanding how they use energy, where they get their energy from, that's a brilliant starting point if you want people to start to think about sustainability in the use of energy and how they do it. So I think the world, and domestically here in Ireland, we see it as part of our public consultation pieces. People are a lot more engaged now about energy security and why we're doing these things, why we're building offshore wind. Yeah. I mean, the public consultation exercises, Angela, we had around the 2 projects, there was a lot of discussion in those halls about energy security and why we're doing this. That's brilliant, because people are beginning to understand better why we're doing these things. That's the starting point to me for that modal shift you're talking about, Dermot. Yeah.
And Angela, similarly, the same question in terms of...
I suppose, like, for us, we'd have seen like the acceptance of renewable energy projects change dramatically in the last number of years. Like, I've been doing onshore for a long time, and in the very beginning, I don't think we did such a great job as bringing the communities with us. And we have to learn from that now as regards offshore. But when we were doing our public consultation, security of supply was a big thing. Biodiversity as well came up to the fore all the time, and I was really surprised at that. Like, I was expecting, the visual impact or jobs would usually would come up, but biodiversity and security of supply. And maybe just to pick up on that, one thing I think we need to do as regards bringing people with us, especially for offshore development. We have one small project in Ireland, but we're going to be deploying a lot more. And it's really important for us as developers, also regulatory bodies, community groups, that we bring the community with us, that we bring that coastal communities with us, we bring the maritime users with us, because it is going to be a shift in maritime use for us here in Ireland. So that's really important for us. So you see that the communities see that the change that's happening, and they will buy into that, as well as then increasing our deployment of electricity. So I really wanted to say that here today. It's sustainable deployment of offshore, like what Bord na Móna have done as regards in the Midlands here, that when we're starting to deploy offshore renewable at scale over the next number of years, that we do it responsibly. We don't look back in 10 years' time and say that we accelerated it too fast without doing it with respect to our oceans. They also act as a carbon sink, similar to the peatlands. So what we do here, and Europe has huge targets of offshore development, but we need to do that in conjunction with marine protected areas, coexistence, and increasing biodiversity.
Yeah.
Dermot, just on that point, actually, because you mentioned the education piece, let's say, and what's happening with our children, and I completely agree with you. I have 2 teenage boys now, and they taught me how to recycle. They taught me which of the 3 bins I should be using in the kitchen. And we saw that in Bord na Móna back in the day when we were beginning to transition and change and looking at the large wind farms, and it was a challenge. Let's be very honest about it. It was a challenge. So we've developed just out the road from here at our Mount Lucas wind farm an open access. I suppose it's a learning hub, we call it, and it's been an incredible success because it's the young people of today. They're the adults of tomorrow. They're the opinion formers. So when you talk about changing mindsets, I think that's where we have to start. And we're very, very focused on that in the energy sector. We're very focused on it in Bord na Móna. We need to get opinion formers who will vouch for this new future and will bring us in that way. And there's no better way to do that than through our education system and through our young people. It's their earth, it's their future.
And I was struck by 2 developments over the last while. One was an announcement last year. I think the other was an announcement a year or 2 ago. One was by the Killybegs Fishermen's Association in terms of that they were looking at developing offshore wind. And the other was by Fexco down in Kerry, which is looking at offshore wind projects. So they would be 2 groups that are rooted very much in the community. Fexco is very much a Kerry company. It's an international company, but it's very much a Kerry company. And you would think almost that fishermen would be the traditional opponents of wind farms for various reasons. So that to me was a sort of a sea change in that. But I'm wondering, one of the things we were talking about previously was who pays for these things. So and we talked about so the price of electricity being relatively cheap, which will spur demand. So in terms of that transition, so you said I live in Kildare, so I can't really cycle. But if there was free public transport, you might use the car an awful lot less, or there'd be different modalities of things. So there's a lot of money required to make this transition at individual house levels, at company levels, and we see a lot of businesses have the money to invest in this. But so who should be paying in terms of this transition?
And this is one of the big questions, and I think globally, I don't believe policymakers, politicians, etc., the industries, the sectors, we probably haven't been honest enough about this. But let's be clear about it. You go back 20 years ago, as I said, 60% of electricity demand annually was met from coal, peat and oil. By 2025, that basket of fuels would be gone. And it's been replaced by something, and we heard this morning that managing wind and managing solar is a little bit different on the power system to managing those big centralised thermal power stations. It can be done, but there's a cost to that. We need to increase and expand the network. We can't connect 20 gigawatts of renewables, we have 5 today, without expanding the network so that we can carry that renewable energy, which is distributed across the island, to demand centres. There's investment required there. The energy transition will require trillions and trillions of euros of investment. It's that simple. And I think society does really need to begin to grapple with how that's going to be paid for, the way it's going to be paid for. Interestingly, because electricity has done most of the heavy lifting to date, the electricity consumer has carried the cost of that. You carry it in your network charges, you carry it in carbon taxation. The price of carbon is embedded now in the cost of electricity generation. And I, for one, believe that as we push electricity as a vector into other sectors to help decarbonise the wider economy, we do need to look at the rate-paying base for that sort of infrastructure development. There's been some very, very interesting commentary recently about using some elements of the tax largesse that we've got, the corporate tax income that we've got, into investing in infrastructure that will serve the purpose of helping that the decarbonisation of the wider economy. And it is certainly something that we have to look at, because the investment required here is enormous, absolutely enormous. And the customer ultimately pays.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add here is just when we talk about infrastructure, like ports is so important for offshore.
Yeah.
We can't, at the moment, as we sit here, there's no port in the Republic of Ireland that can serve offshore wind. So investment in the likes of Rosslare, Cork, Shannon, they're absolutely critical for long-term, the long-term targets in Ireland. We're doing a study at the moment to see what ports are available to us for our projects for 2030. And if you look at all the other targets in France and in the UK, port capacity is going to fill up very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And also the time scale that you need to bring the likes of Rosslare, Cork or Shannon to a point where we can use them, where the vessels can use them, it is going to take us 6-7 years. So port infrastructure is critical for us, but also you can look at it in a positive way for Ireland too, is in that if there's going to be French ports that are going to be at capacity, UK ports that are going to be at capacity, there is an option for those ports to service other European countries as well, like the way we're looking at UK ports or we're looking at French ports.
Yeah.
So just to add on to what John was saying, is just port infrastructure.
Yeah. And we're probably talking about the ships to service and bring the turbines and service the turbines and manage. So like it's the ports, but it's everything else that goes with that as well. Yeah. It's the whole of that infrastructure. So one of the things that then came up, John, you were talking about how the last million tonnes or the last 10% is going to be expensive, and the last 5% very expensive, and the last couple of percent, like, how expensive? So are we going to still have some, or is that going to be nuclear? One of the things recently is Finland brought its first.
You can't say that, Dermot. Special brancher at the back door.
So no, I think so. Look, it's and I know very little about it, but I'm looking at it. Right, Finland turned on a nuclear power plant, and the price of its electricity briefly went negative. Right, and there's huge challenges. France had to shut down its nuclear power plants because the rivers were running dry and it couldn't cool them last year. So you have, it's not as simple. Build a project, and the projects have massive cost overruns and everything else. But that last piece, if it's not to be, if we're not to go back to, we still need to keep 10% burning oil because we need that 10% because of intermittency. Right, there will be wind blowing somewhere on the planet, but we may not be able to get it, and we may not have enough battery capacity. So what is that last 10%? Is it nuclear? Is it back to the traditional fuels? Is it back to, there's a lot of talk about hydrogen and almost as a mechanism for storing energy and then re-releasing it again. So what mechanism do you think is going to, and maybe it's a mix, will plug those gaps?
Yeah, I think in the first instance what you have to look at is, in terms of, and we're very lucky here in Ireland, you come back to the wind story, offshore and onshore. Angela said earlier on, and genuinely, there are countries in Europe that would die to have the resource that we have in wind, which is infinitely manageable. Once you get the infrastructure in place, we know how to capture it, we know how to use it, we know how to manage it on the power system. So if you take Ireland, there should be no reason whatsoever with technologies that are in place today that we get from where we are today, where 40% of electricity demand is met from renewables, give or take. The other 60% will be flexible gas. The other fossil fuels will be gone. What we are going to see over the next decade in this transition is an acceleration of the deployment of renewables, wind, and increasingly solar, particularly rooftop solar, to take demand away from the grid, effectively. You can see that happening today. And we should get to a point in the middle of the next decade where 90% of electricity demand on an annual basis is met from renewables. The key question will be, what is the other 10%? And you cannot get away what Katie was talking about this morning in terms of managing the voltage and managing that living, breathing beast that is an electric power system. There will be a need for what we call firm backup capacity for the times that the wind doesn't blow, even in Ireland. Look at the bosses here telling me what's happened in the last 10 days. There's no wind blowing. We have to be able to manage those periods, and they don't just last for hours. So batteries can do something. We're talking about days and maybe a couple of weeks where we need to have something else to fill that gap. That will be gas, and it'll be whether other technologies come along in a cost-effective way to ultimately squeeze that gas out. What we're looking at in Bordemona is, first of all, how do we decarbonise that gas? So the use of biomethane rather than natural gas. The use of green hydrogen. It can fill that gap if we can do it cost-effectively. But I think as we see the acceleration of the decarbonisation of the wider economy, we need to figure out what will be those technologies, zero-carbon technologies, that will back up across the economy with much wider demand that will back up renewables. And there may even be technologies, Dermot, that we don't know about today. I'm absolutely not speaking on behalf of Bordemona here. This is a John Riley view. We don't want it in the front of the paper that Bordemona is developing nuclear.
CEO and chairman have both nodded. You're fine.
But if you go forward to 2050, when Ireland has to completely remove carbon from its economy, it's very difficult for me as a technical person to see how you get to that point where electricity demand, by the way, could be 3 times what it is today. 3 times. And the bulk of that is supplied by intermittent resources. What's going to back that up is important. So it may be something like nuclear fusion, a safe technology, that sits there and provides that baseload backup along with other flexible technologies. And I think there is no silver bullet. It will be a mixture of technologies. And the winner will be the technology that can do it in the most cost-effective way.
Yeah.
It's that simple. And that's why we in Bordemona have great faith in the hydrogen story. Again, it's a technology that's well understood. We produce hydrogen globally today for domestic processes, or industrial processes, I should say. And it's a gas, and you can burn it in an engine, and it could provide backup in a zero-carbon way because we're producing it from water using green electricity, so it's green hydrogen. When you combust it, there's no carbon, there's no CO2. The question with hydrogen is a question of cost. It's a question of cost. And we, thanks to the support of the board in Bordemona and our shareholder, we're moving forward with a hydrogen project just out the road here in Mount Lucas. Next year we will install a 2-megawatt electrolyser where we will produce hydrogen as a clean green fuel source from wind in Offaly. And what we want to do is to learn over a period of years, where can that green hydrogen fit into the wider energy system? Does it work economically? Is it going to be too expensive? And if we can get that to work, and I really hope we can, in the context of the offshore space and the amount of green hydrogen that Ireland could produce. So if hydrogen becomes a solution to the global energy security and climate challenge, Ireland stands to be an enormous winner in that space. But other technologies, I have no doubt, will come along. Carbon capture and storage, for example. Maybe we will still be burning methane because we're able to capture that carbon and do something else with it.
I think we've got to be very careful about that. It's a bit like carbon offsetting, right? It always struck me as like the plenary indulgence.
Yeah, it's been a challenge. It's been a challenge technically. I mean, if you go back 20 years ago, the electricity industry in Europe, as it was facing into this decarbonisation process, put a lot of faith in carbon capture and storage. Unfortunately, the technology hasn't really advanced at a cost-competitive rate to allow it to to be stuck onto the back of thermal power stations so we can continue to burn coal or peat or gas. But I wouldn't give up hope on it. I think it'll be a mixture of things. That's what it'll be for sure. And who knows? Ireland may have to have that adult discussion about the role of nuclear power, but maybe in the form of nuclear fusion.
Yeah. Angela, in terms of any other thoughts on that last couple of percent or around hydrogen or anything, and we just have a few minutes left, any, I suppose, final comments then as we...
Yeah, there's an awful lot of talk at the moment, it's like globally, as regard linking hydrogen with offshore wind, and it kind of goes back to my very first point, is in with these large-scale targets and the resource that we have in Ireland, there has to be something other than just putting it onto the grid. And if that's hydrogen, there's probably people more informed than me in the room as in what percentage of green hydrogen we can get onto the network. But then you're tapping into transport and heating in a way that maybe the grid infrastructure can't enable us to do. So linking, even looking at, I suppose, the more conventional technologies as regards bottom fixed to a hydrogen strategy. And the chair earlier said this morning, it's all small steps. You know, you have to start with a small amount, start with a pilot project with an offshore bottom fixed, link it to hydrogen, develop from there. Small steps add up. We've seen that in the onshore deployment in Ireland here, you know, building just on regulatory, building on policy, bringing the communities with us. So I think that's the same that we need to approach with hydrogen.
John, any final comments?
Yeah, I think just to go back to that question that you asked, Dermot, about, you know, what do we need to do as individuals and what do we need to do as companies? I think we need to define in our own worlds and in our own space what sustainability means to us.
Yeah.
And as Jeff has said, each of us to make those small steps to understand, particularly about our energy consumption and what alternatives there are for us. But I also think that, you know, if you look at the challenges we have around security of energy supply in Ireland at the moment, because the economy has rebounded from COVID like nothing you've ever seen. It was powering ahead anyway. Ireland has become a global centre for the ICT sector, for example. And in terms of economic growth, and I'd have to say, I'm in favour of meeting the needs of our economy in a sustainable way, not deciding that we should stymie economic growth in whatever form it is to solve the climate challenge. We don't need to do that. We have the technologies, we have the resource here in Ireland. So one of the concepts that we're working on is how we help solve that challenge that the data centre sector, the ICT sector has, in terms of opening up parts of our land bank where we can co-locate large 21st century demand right alongside 21st century renewable generation. We want to be part of that solution in Bord-na-Móna. We have a very, very unique piece in terms of our land bank. We've got involved in a wonderful joint venture to pursue the offshore sector and the offshore space. We believe in the Irish renewable story, and we believe passionately that we can solve Ireland's security of supply and climate changes by doing one simple thing: driving at renewables.
So John's going to be moving from head of renewables to head of marketing shortly after this session. I think optimism is important, right? There's a lot of challenges ahead of us.
Yeah. We can say cull the national herd and that solves the problem. We shouldn't be looking at things like that.
Well, probably a broader discussion. But I think what the most interesting piece for me out of this is to say that, you know, we have the solutions to 90% of that energy transition. The last 10% is like any form of innovation. It's going to be messy. It's going to be complicated. We're going to have to, but we have the tools to do it. So, John, Angela, thank you very much for your insight. Also, thank you very much for what the companies are doing. Right, this is a fundamental re-altering society. So, look, fascinating for me to chat with you this morning. So, thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thank you.